Charlottesville on the East Coast, I think it is, of the United States. And I've been following David's work for many years now, and particularly around the whole COVID thing. And he's been incredibly influential and such a warrior for getting the truth out to people like me, who otherwise would be blissfully ignorant. Well, not blissfully ignorant, but certainly ignorant. And so it's a real honor to welcome you, David. And I know you're involved with many, many projects, social projects and banking and all kinds of stuff. So it's a great
John, it's great to spend time with you, and delighted that we have had the mutual of friends that wove the tapestry to get us together.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Thank you. So I wanted to start with this really, because as you probably know, we are therapists primarily. We're also family members, and we got friends, and I've struggled with this for many years about what is the best thing that we can do as individuals to really help humanity. And I came to the conclusion many years ago that the best thing would be to focus on supporting mums and babies, because that helps with things like transgenerational trauma that you see being played out all over the world, in politics, and these politicians who've never really dealt with any of their stuff and just play it out, and we have to deal with the horrendous consequences of it. But since the whole COVID thing, and since listening to people like you, really was a wake-up call in terms of where we need to pay attention to right now and where we need to put our energies to. So I was wondering if you could just start with that, really, about where do we need to focus? Because what seems to be happening is so urgent and so difficult to comprehend, and so against our kind of nature as kind of people that are giving kind of natures. It's very, very difficult for us to comprehend where someone will be coming from such a different kind of place of greed, and whatever you call it, ignorance, evil even. I don't know what you call it. But anyway, could you talk a little bit about that? Where should we be focusing right now?
Well, John, beautiful setup, and I think it's worthy of taking a step back from an ontology standpoint and just asking a very fundamental question. The carrier frequency upon which fear is propagated is something that we embed in our social consciousness at such a very early age that I think you're spot on with your mums and babies approach.
Yeah.
I would go maybe even slightly further. I think we need to open the aperture of at least considering that the broad arc of what we define as life has been unfortunately commoditized to a point where we are, in many instances, the sum of our sense of this temporal experience, rather than looking at ourselves as the stewards of a life force energy which is persistent. Mm-hmm. So I think that we need to think very carefully about the infection that we make when we infect fear into children at a very, very, very early age. Mm-hmm. I think the vast majority of parents have no concept of what it is like to experience a world where you hold open the possibility of life and optimism and positivity in very, very early childhood development. And in fact, I would go as far as to say, conception forward.
I would agree.
Where we look at the broader sense of what are we doing to wire current life forms on this planet with this capacity to be unusually and potentially hyper attuned to the frequency of fear or panic.
Yeah.
I think we need to really be thinking very carefully about the fact that it is not by accident that the current campaign of terror has focused on injecting pregnant women, adding into pregnancy an already, in this day and age, an already stressful situation, an even greater stressor, which unfortunately, whether it's epigenetically or actually genetically, is putting into the nascent life form this receptivity to fear. So I'm glad that we're talking about this, because the fact is that while we can zoom into the micro of the actual experience that's happened over the last 4 years,
Yeah.
I think we need to take a step back and say the macro is something that I go back to, ironically, the 4th century.
Mm-hmm.
And you heard me say that correctly. I think in the 4th century, society adopted a willingness to accept this idea of the transference, the commutation of evil and sin and brokenness. We had the doctrine of original sin that was invented in the 4th century. We had this idea out of the Judeo-Christian tradition of this heritable nature of evil, but we specifically were willing to defile the sacredness of the incarnation of every being on this planet. We were able to socially accept the possibility that a perfect and pure life energy coming into this planet was somehow already defiled. And I don't think that we can address the problem of what we call COVID until we pull out the root of the weed, which was certainly planted in the 4th century and then watered vigorously ever since, where we have decided that we can accept the possibility of what Anthony Fauci most recently dubbed asymptomatic transfer, right? Asymptomatic spread is no different from pecado originale, the original sin doctrine that was put into the Catholic Church back in the 4th and 5th century. So I think it's important for us to realize, and that's why I love where this conversation starts. If we weren't wired to be carrier frequencies of fear, and if we actively address that, so mothers and expectant fathers would have the ability to be encouraged to bring calm into the gestation period and then bring calm into that early childhood period so that the baby is enveloped in a protective matrix of positivity and of kindness and of calm. In my 12 senses course, I teach the fact that one of the first nerves that our body develops, the trigeminal nerve, is actually the only active nerve we have to control our state of calm or hyperactivity. And people forget that the body, when it is appropriately functioning, is calm.
Yes.
That's what the parasympathetic system is.
Absolutely.
And the sympathetic system is actually when we dysregulate, when we fall out of active regulation of our parasympathetic system. So the irony is we don't have fight or flight. We actually have calm. And I think that we need to make sure that we are addressing that, and particularly as clinicians, encouraging expectant parents to discipline themselves into wiring the infant for calm so that we don't embed the carrier frequency of fear, which is how terror spreads.
Yeah, I agree with you. And it's very interesting listening to some of the investors in the early Facebook and social media, how it seems like it was deliberately formed to stimulate people's sympathetic nervous system, to put them into fight or flight deliberately in order to have more sharing and more disputes, and then you get more advertising and, you know, that, right? So
exactly. And we live in a world, exactly right. We live in a world where we have encouraged, and I would go as far as to say almost imprisoned, the socialization narrative into something where we are expectant. We are expectant of likes or dislikes. We're expectant of polarity-based conflict, which is derived from artificial dualities. These are all things that we are expected to experience. And then we create technologies that amplify that expectation. And then we wonder how it is possible that we can have entire coup d'etats of the public interest where it takes nothing more than a very simple, redundant, and persistent message of fear. And lo and behold, we can get 2/3 of the population of the world to accept a genetic therapy.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's extraordinary, isn't it? And I wanted to come back to the whole COVID thing, and particularly, I mean, because it's very easy for us to go into fear and overwhelm and kind of like and ask ourselves the question, well, what actually can we do in the current situation
Yeah.
to you know, because certainly from my perspective, it was impossible to talk to people who were resistant to this idea, that because it seems so far out of one's normal experience that this people would be so irresponsible as to do something like, you know, inject half the population in the world with something which is untested. So, you know, so what can we do really in this situation, would you say?
Well, John, one of the things that I have criticized since my public commentary on this pandemic starting in March and April of 2020, when the rest of the world found out what I was talking about, one of the things that I've encouraged is that potentially we could see this as an indictment of those of us who at least like to think of ourselves as somewhat more attuned to humanity, that maybe we've done a terrible job of modeling an attractive form of humanity. Maybe there is almost a repentance required on the side of those of us who think of ourselves as thoughtful. We think of ourselves as considered. We think of ourselves as not subject to reflexive behaviors. Maybe we have actually failed first in modeling a form of humanity that is so compelling and so desirable that the fear narrative and the control narrative and the suppression narrative have no attraction simply because there's a better alternative. And I have encouraged all of us, and I do it with myself, I've encouraged all of us to examine what role do we play in modeling the best of humanity rather than criticizing the worst. What we call here in the United States armchair quarterbacking or Monday morning quarterbacking, where we can criticize the fault in others. You know, in the Gospels, they refer to the speck in your brother's eye while you have a plank in your own eye.
Yeah.
You know, I think there's a need for us first to examine our own planks, right? Make sure that we don't have a blindness where our critique is potentially justified, but maybe is not entirely justified against the backdrop of, did we actually do what we could do to place ourselves as the offerers of a compelling alternative? And I think we need to always do that. I think we need to always be conscious and humble enough to say, maybe part of the problem is that we became insular in our kind of self-proclaimed, you know, state of consciousness or evolution. And maybe we need to eat just a tiny bit of humble pie to get to the place where we can offer a compelling alternative to the current narrative. And I encourage people to do that. That means engage in kindness rather than engaging with a justified rage or a justified conviction.
Yeah.
And I know that there are people who think that that's maybe a little Pollyannish, but from my standpoint, I think that if we're going to advocate for a more human experience, it's incumbent on us to model that experience rather than aspire to some sort of abstraction. And so I think the first step is that self-examination. But I think the second step, which is equally important, is, as you know, now going 4 years and counting from my very first public appearance, the vast majority of the content that I've produced, John, has not been taken off even the incumbent social platforms. It has not been taken off Facebook. It has not been taken off YouTube. And if you go back and ask the question why, the question why is answered very simply. I have supplied in every single presentation I've made documented and cited evidence from the conspirators' own reality. This is not offering my opinion. I'm trying to share information. And what I've done over the last 4 years in the situations around COVID is no different than what I did when it was 2001 and it was anthrax. And it's no different than what I did when it was the EpiPen scandal, which is present information in a way where I'm not seeding it with a belief requirement. I'm not asking you to believe a thing. I'm simply asking you to consider information, which leads me to my second and more compelling issue. I think we need to suspend our obsession with belief and, do you believe this? Do you believe that? Do you believe something else?
Mhm.
and reclaim the power of objective observation, where we simply say, we're going to expand the aperture of what people can consider,
Mhm.
and then let people consider that expanded aperture. Because the fact is, and this is where I would have to go down the pathway of saying I'm probably a pathologic optimist. I think people presented in a calm state with evidence most often make the right decision.
Mhm.
I think when people are conflicted and when they are entered into dialogue in a confrontational space, I think the vast majority of people shut down, not for the content, but for the way in which the content is delivered. So I think we need to be very thoughtful. I think we need to be measured. I think we need to be kind. I think there are a lot of things that are required so that we have the ability to have a compelling voice that stands constant against the maelstrom of the craziness that is pumped out by mainstream media.
Yeah. And it seems also that we need to create communities like that, right? So we
Yes,
attract people to us to create those kind of safe spaces and sense of community that can support that because we can't do it on our own, right?
exactly.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. So okay, and then in terms of what's happening in the world, we had James Rogoski on recently about talking about WHO and all that kind of stuff, you know. So very easy to get fear-based around all that
Yeah.
and activated around it. And then he was talking about gain of function research and all that. I know you've done a huge amount of work in that area. Um, and again, like because it feels so huge, this thing, right? And it's very easy to feel disempowered.
Yeah.
So again, come back to this question as like in the face of that, which I know some people see as a almost like a battle between good and evil. I don't know how you see it, but it feels like that to me sometimes. Uh, and there feels like a necessity to speak truth
Yeah.
in this. And at this time, it feels like a really important time to hold one's truth, right?
Yeah. So let's take that apart a little bit. One of the things that I find fascinating is our stories, whether it's David and Goliath, whether it is the Odyssean narratives, whether it is any of our kind of hero epic stories where it's one against the darkness.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, which is
and the the Campbell certainty that every human story has to have this hero journey arc.
Mhm.
Um, Joseph Campbell was making an observation. He was not making a prognosis or a diagnosis. He was making an observation, which we seem to celebrate stories where we have the unlikely hero who, against usually the rejection or at least the apathy of his community, begins a quest, finds the darkest of the darkness, goes through this horrific tide of both self-examination and then, the hero journey nonsense about you have to confront the multi-headed beast that has sharp teeth, and then you have to be seduced by the siren that's going to eat you, and then all of these wonderful crushing rocks and falling stars and whatnot.
Yeah.
Inside of that narrative, we have the most insidious and probably the most harmful piece of the narrative, which is somewhere along the line, Gandalf shows up with a magic stick, or with a ring, or with a sword that's drawn from a stone, or with something where this metaphysical reliance on the extraterrestrial or extra cosmological thing is the thing, which then allows our hero to fight his way alone out of this misery and follow the shining light to the promised land. Now, the reality is that story has never happened. In reality, it never has happened. It's stories. But unfortunately, those stories become mimetic of how we think the darkness versus light narrative plays out.
Hmm.
I've said in many instances, apocalypses are grossly overrated. We've never had the darkest of the darkness that's been forecast. It's never happened, ever. So the good news is the darkness is never as dark as we like to portray it. And equally, the hero that is this solitary figure that fights into the darkness and then fights his way out with the help of the mythical fairy or the long-bearded wizard or whatever that thing is, also doesn't happen. What happens is that real people recognize, not unlike what we refer to in the Judeo-Christian tradition of the minor prophets, not unlike that, where almost to a prophet, everybody goes, oh my gosh, it's the end of the world. Everybody's bad. You know, we're in captivity. We're watching Jerusalem fall, blah, 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 blah. And the message in the prophets is always the same, which is there's always a remnant. You know what that means? There's always more than you. There's never just the hero that's alone against the odds, right? There's, whether it's the 300 standing in Persepolis or in the Hell's Gates when the Persians are attacking, whether it's the Spartans against the Greek states, whether it is the London based and then the 7th and 8th legions and then the mysterious 9th legion, it's always a group of people who find the capacity to understand that finding your essence, being your essence, and manifesting your essence allows you to win the ultimate wars that are wars of attrition. They are not wars of dominance.
Mm-hmm.
This is a situation where the last story standing is the prevailing story. I just finished reading Graham Hancock's The Sign and the Seal again, which is a fascinating book. Mm-hmm. But it's the story of this Coptic myth about the Ark of the Covenant that may or may not be somewhere in Ethiopia or may not be somewhere else.
Yeah.
And what I find fascinating inside of that myth is the story that he weaves in around the Templars and their crosses that seem to show up, ironically, in a number of places in Ethiopia. But what made that mission potentially the success that it was not the cult of the individual. It was the obsession that said that there needs to be a collective which holds the light. And in this particular case, what, the argument is in Graham's book is that collective happened to be a bunch of, white-skinned, red-haired guys that happened to have red crosses on their shirts and wound up building these mysterious churches somewhere in Ethiopia. What's the point of it? The point of it is the real stories that have been the persistence of luminosity throughout our world have not been individual stories of heroism. Mm-hmm. They have been team stories, and the team doesn't even identify as the, NBA. We don't need a superstar. We don't need the guy who always hits the three-point shot. What we need is a group of people who understand that the mission of advancing the cause of a better humanity is more important than their individual sense of position or status or anything else. And I think what we've lost, even among what we would call the medical freedom movement or whatever we want to call this thing, is we're still seeing the trivial nature of who gets the spotlight. Mm-hmm. And I sit there going, well, if we're fighting that battle, that's the wrong battle. What we need to do is we need to see ourselves as a phalanx, not as a sole fighter, right? This has got to be my shield is defending your sword, and your sword is now on offense so that you can actually fight effectively. And my neighbor's shield is shielding me so I can fight effectively. This is a phalanx. It is not a guerrilla campaign. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people have resorted to the guerrilla campaign method because they don't understand the nature of the enemy, and they also don't understand the nature of the campaign. Mm-hmm. This is where the World Health Organization, as I've said before, is a very interesting target, because most people are saying the World Health Organization, should somehow be curtailed or should somehow be limited, or the IHR should be stopped and all that kind of stuff. And I go back, and as I've said many times, the World Health Organization by 1953 was unequivocally a racketeering, antitrust violating, competitiveness law violating, criminal conspiratorial organization. Mm-hmm. And what we should be doing is we should have a public conversation about eradicating the criminal organization and its structure and the liability shields that it presented for itself. We should be going after the criminal structure of the thing, not attacking IHR, because attacking the treaty, which, by the way, I have no interest in seeing that treaty ever become reality. That I'm not suggesting that there's some salutatory benefit for that treaty, but what I am saying is fighting the treaty is the stuff of the hero epic story, and
Right.
looking at the core, the foundation of the problem, that structural problem that said in 1953, we are going to allow a criminal racketeering organization, which by 1953 had been unambiguously set up to be the commercial front door for injection manufacturers. That is what it was set up for.
Mhm.
Make no mistake, this was not about maternal health. This was not about, nutrition. This was not about making sure people had access to critical medical technologies. This was about advancing a single objective, which was funded exclusively at the time by the Wellcome Trust, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the politicians they controlled. And by
Mhm.
1953, this was a criminal racket. And Bill Gates, when he added Gavi to the mix, just put a third co-conspirator in. This is a criminal organization. We should be talking about it like the mafia. We should not be talking about it as though it is a legitimate organization.
Mhm. Absolutely. So if you're a wonderful optimist, then can you look forward?
Pathologically optimistic. Absolutely.
Pathologically, I like it. Pathologically optimist. Yeah, great. I think I'd like the bit of that as well. So looking forward, David, to because a lot of people are worried, understandably worried, particularly with the whole gain of function thing and what
Yep.
can happen with all that. How do you see that panning out?
Yeah.
Your perspective.
Well, so as I said on the interview I did recently with the Epoch Times,
Yeah,
one of the things that is critical for us to understand is that what the treaty is really trying to do is it's really trying to consolidate the cover up that is going on with the biological weapons programs that is currently being supported by most WHO member states.
yeah,
And that the lead of those member states is obviously research being done by the United States, the European Union, and the United Kingdom. Those are the people who are currently running the biggest parts of the racket. Now, I'm not saying the Germans and the Dutch aren't in on it, and
yeah.
some of the Swedes are not in on it. But what I'm saying is predominantly this is a Department of Defense across the EU. We could generally say NATO ally states. We could generally say there's a fairly significant contribution coming from Asia, although I have to say that the vast majority of the Asian research still has US DoD influence in it. But the
Mm.
fact of the matter is, what we're doing is we're watching the criminal conspiracy reach even further into the possibility of the suspension of universal human rights as well as individual member state defined civil and human rights.
Yeah,
And what we are doing right now is watching the convergence of somewhat the edge of lunacy, where the market test that is happening, and I refer to it as a market test simply because I think COVID was a market test. It was how much are people willing to acquiesce and how much do they push back against various grabs of whether it's civil liberties, universal human rights, or ethical and legal standards on the protection of the individual human autonomy. These are all things that are being tested.
and
And
the results of that test here in the USA and the UK were not very good, right?
no. What it basically said was 70% of the class failed.
Yeah, exactly.
Now the good news is that's a midterm grade. That's not the final. That's a midterm.
Right.
For a few unfortunate souls, it was the final because they participated and significant adverse events, including death, including permanent disability, was the outcome. But for the vast majority, we just failed the midterm, right? The final grade is not in. The
Mhm.
final grade is coming. But this is where we need to see the collective narrative pivot away from this debate or argument is more appropriate. The argument about, coronavirus, COVID, this, that, the other thing, and then, the terrain guys versus the virus guys, and all of these skirmishes that are happening on the margins. And we need to go back and say, no, hold on a minute. somewhere along the line, and certainly in the United States, it was 1905, Oliver Wendell Holmes and his colleagues on the Supreme Court, who actually decided that in the case of what was deemed public health interest, the individual no longer had standing to demand liberty and rights. Now, we could go back in time. We could go much further back. I could go back to 1604 in England, and I could tell you why the update to the Treason Act, which suspended civil liberties if a monarch decided you looked crazy. There's a lot of other things that undermined the notion of civil liberty a long time ago. But here in the United States, certainly 1905, the Jacobson case became this icon of justifying that in the name of health, we can destroy liberty. That fundamental paradox is what we should collectively put our energies towards, because what we need to do is we need to say that there is no such thing as health outside of liberty. If you are controlled, if you are manipulated, if you are placed under some sort of constraint, you will not be healthy. And John, whether it's the mRNA that's triggering the turbo cancers and the cardiovascular disease, or whether it is the institutionalization of fear, I'm actually not willing to go out on a limb and say which one is more important, because I genuinely think that fear ultimately becomes its own metastatic disease inside of a human being. So can I confidently say it was the shot, or can I confidently say it was the fear induction that took place across 3.5 years that is creating all of the rampant diseases that we see absolutely blossoming all over the world? And I would say that it is at least covariant, right? That there's a contribution of what came in the injection, but there's also a significant contribution of what came with the social fear. What can we do? Conversations like this, conversations like this are perfect to say, oh, hold on a minute. You mean if I institute 15 minutes of calm, I happen to do an enormous amount of calming disciplines every day.
Right.
That is something that involves meditation. It involves music. For me, it also involves cold water immersion. I like getting my parasympathetic nervous system fully functioning. There's a number of things that we can do. And by the way, the person listening to this particular broadcast, you can fill a bowl with ice water, put ice cubes in it, and plant your face in it for 15 seconds. Because of a beautiful evolutionary mandate that was wired into every mammal, we have the mammalian dive reflex. And in 15 seconds, you can reset your parasympathetic nervous system. You don't have to do a 15, 20, 30-minute meditation with bowls and chants and everything else. Fill a bowl with ice water, put some ice in it, dunk your face in it, hold it in for 15 seconds, and lo and behold, you're resetting your parasympathetic nervous system. That's not a hard thing to do, but you must realize that a world with calm is a world that allows liberty to flourish. And a world where we're trapped in reflex and a world where we're trapped in fear allows disease to flourish. So we need to be the community that embraces active calm.
Absolutely. I mean, we've had a lot on with Stephen Porges and the whole polyvagal theory stuff, and it's really wonderful the way he describes it and how important it is to create safety and community.
Yes.
Well, our nervous systems are wired for that, right?
Yeah.
Wired for that, and they're wired for cooperation.
Exactly.
And
that's
right?
exactly right. We are in fact an organism, not an individual, and we is the organism.
Absolutely. And we've evolved like that over thousands and thousands of years. So, David, when you're talking about, the equality between freedom and health, right? So you say we need to address that to? Who do we address that to, right? In this situation right now, who do we need to?
Well, John, remember that the pandemic was marketed by a very simple technology. Very few messages repeated very often. Nearly hypnotic. Every night we got sickness counts, death counts. Every night we got, this count, that count. But it was really simple. There were no more than 3 to 6 messages, and they were repeated all the time. Unfortunately, in the what has generally branded itself the health freedom movement, we've had 150 messages, and they're delivered in drive-by shootings on panels with 10 minutes a panel, and it's everything in the kitchen sink. It's voting integrity. It's does the system work? Is 5G a problem? Is Bitcoin a problem? Is this or that, the other thing a problem? And so what happens is we distract ourselves with the number of things that could be the giant scary thing in the closet.
Right.
And then we have no ability to recite it. And unfortunately, we haven't learned from the other side. We haven't learned from the darkness. And that may have something to do with why the light seems to be at least fledgling, if not flickering sometimes to the point of being snuffed. Ask yourself, when are you sufficiently done informing your local politician of the criminal racketeering conspiracy that led to COVID and their potential role in it? I've had tons of people, by the way, and I celebrate this. There are tons of people in my ecosystem who have sent hundreds of thousands of copies of the Fauci dossier to their elected officials. Now, the Fauci dossier, which I put out in 2021, well, late 2020, it became fully public in early 2021.
Yep.
The Fauci dossier is downloadable in PDF form everywhere on Earth. You can download it, you can print it, or you can download it and you can send it to your elected official. Now, a lot of people have done that, and I applaud it. But the problem is they did it once and got demoralized that the official didn't take any action. Well, newsflash, there's a reason why we did nightly reports of COVID illness and death counts. We did that as a society to brainwash a society. Well, guess what we have to do on the other side? We have to do the same thing. We need not to send that dossier once. We need to send it every single day to our elected officials, to our city councils, to our barristers and jurists, to everyone who actually is in a position of power. Because as much as you might convince yourself that you've done your part because you sent a letter or you went to a protest or you marched once in London or you marched once in Graz, Austria, or wherever you wound up doing your thing, the fact of the matter is, until we as a collective organism continually keep the message front and center, we will have failed ourselves. The capacity to be demoralized. I mean, think about this conversation, John, and then ask yourself a very simple sociological question. David Martin has the worst batting average of anybody who's ever stepped to the plate. I have been on hundreds, probably thousands of interviews, conversations, experiences, etc., over the last 4 years. And we could argue that it has been terribly, terribly unproductive if we measure it by, is Anthony Fauci in jail? Is Ralph Baric in jail? Is the prime minister who ordered X, Y, or Z in jail? And the answer is that the story isn't over yet. I said this was a midterm, not a final exam. The final exam is, are we going to be persistent, or are we going to allow ourselves to be demoralized? And remember, being demoralized and going inactive because allegedly the problem is too big is because we're not taking the incremental steps every day to actually remind ourselves that the problem isn't that big. The problem is our collective complacency. And so what we need to be doing is we need to be making sure that every single day we've taken action to remind the people who have positions of elected positions or appointed positions, we need to remind them that crimes are being committed. And we have placed a ton of available material out there for anyone who wants to do so to continually print and forward. And for those people who sit there and say, well, but Dave, it never ultimately matters. It just goes into the waste bin of their inbox or whatever. The answer is, I got good news for you. After almost 3 years, I finally had the privilege of sitting down with Attorney General, with whom I was actually scheduled to meet several years ago.
Yeah.
And because of the persistence of the public message alone, not only did he sit down, but he also agreed to begin a process of actually doing the full criminal investigation I've been asking for. Now, John, I could make the mistaken conclusion that the power of my words was what was persuasive. And I have to say that there's a bit of credit that goes to the fact that I've kept on message and I have stayed where I've stayed. But the real thing that drove that was not me. The real thing that drove that was others who kept the message in front of this individual.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
keeping the message in front of the individual, finally, like water cracking rocks. You know, you need some freezing and thawing. You need some seasonality. You need some things that are outside of your control. But what you need to do is persist. And that is what I would collectively say if we were looking at how we're going as we're getting past the midterm and going to the final.
Yeah.
That's where we're failing. We are not keeping the message in front of people. As a community, we gave up. And I want to reinvigorate that fire within everybody to say, this is not the time to give up. Actually, ironically, the other side is giving up because they think they won.
Yeah.
So the good news is let them think that and keep the pressure on. Because if we do, we will prevail.
Absolutely. Thank you. So you mentioned it. I know you got to go soon, David. You mentioned the understanding, I think you said understanding the nature of the enemy, right?
Yes.
And this is something that I've struggled with a lot, the mentality. And it comes back to what we started with, perhaps, which is that a lot of these people who are in control seem to be working from themselves from a place of fear, I would say. Fear because they want to control everything.
Absolutely.
They want blah, 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 you know. And so could you talk a bit about the nature of this sort of mentality that we're dealing with?
Yes.
Right?
Yes, and let's be very clear, as I've said many times. The actions of evil are, in fact, where we judge good and evil. The actions. Very seldom is the actor essentially good or evil. And by that, I mean the person who is actually in the process of carrying out whatever that thing is very seldom incapable of goodness. Most of them are not true sociopaths. Now, I think there are a few, but the vast majority are not true sociopaths. What they are, to your point, are people who themselves are fearful or broken or feel ostracized, feel a desperate need for power and control. And I think that part of our mission is to hold grace around the possibility that if those individuals were met, not with a disrespect of them as individuals, but an indictment of the behavior that they are manifesting, we would be in a much better position collectively. I think anytime a person who already feels somehow socially inadequate feels under attack, I think they usually double down. And I've seen that in my own behavior. I've seen that in the behavior of others. Yeah. If I feel like I need to defend myself, I become more reflexive and less conscious.
Yeah.
So I would encourage people to stop with the individual critique and make sure that even if you say Anthony Fauci's a bad guy, make sure that that sentence includes the what about his behavior is bad, not that he is bad, right? Now, by the way, I'm not suggesting he's not sociopathic. I think if you look at his own behavior, there's a whole lot of evidence for it. But what I'm simply saying is that I think we need to still, even in the case of the worst offenders, we need to make sure that we focus on the actions that they are taking, which are illegal, unethical, antisocial, etc. We need to focus on the actions they're taking and avoid getting trapped in this personality cult that tells people that's a bad person.
I agree, absolutely.
And I think that that's probably the transformation of our collective narrative that we need to make sure we advance very aggressively now. Because I think in exasperation, we are probably contributing to the motivation these people have to double down.
I agree with you, yeah. I mean, looking at it from our perspective of like pre and perinatal trauma, you can see very clearly with a lot of these people how they're living that out.
Yeah,
And you know, and from that perspective, I think one can have quite a lot of compassion. And the,
exactly.
you know, for me, the sad part is, well, why was this not addressed when they were very young? You know,
Exactly.
even before they were born, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Mothers were supported, you know, because a lot of this, I often think about like Henry VIII. My God, what would have happened if Henry VIII had a bit of therapy? You
Yeah.
know, like it would have, the whole
There would have been a few
country would
more necks that would have been spared, I'm sure.
have. Yeah. Well, thanks, David. It's been a real delight to talk to you. I know you've got to head off now. So,
John, it's an honor. Thank you so much for taking the time, and I do look forward to our next conversation.
yeah, absolutely. Great. And thank you, everybody. Thank you. Bye bye. Thanks, David.
Bye.